The grand terminal of the Galleria luxury mall erupted into a different kind of chaos. High-end shoppers froze mid-stride, their designer bags dangling as security guards reached for their radios in a panic. It wasn't because of a bomb or a heist. It was because Vincenzo the Ghost Moretti had just charged through the gilded entrance. His fur-collared overcoat was soaked through with the evening rain, billowing behind him like a dark cloud as he moved with a heavy, purposeful stride. He wasn't there to spend. He was there to save an empire from drowning in its own wealth. Standing in the center of the polished marble floor, Vincenzo looked down at the scene that had triggered the emergency. Dozens of soldier accountants in bespoke suits stood motionless, clutching heavy leather briefcases that had burst open, spilling stacks of $100 bills across the floor like autumn leaves. Beside the mountain of cash stood a regional capo, sweat dripping onto his flawless silk tie, his mouth stretched into a terrified, performative smile. "It's just a delay at the bank, Vincenzo," the capo said quickly, his voice trembling. "The federal censors at the branch picked up a trace of something, but we're handling it. It's just an accident of the new laws." Vincenzo didn't answer. He stepped over the scattered millions and looked at the storefront of the Gucci flagship he had used as a primary washing machine for 3 years. His heart stopped for a beat as he saw the yellow federal seizure tape being stretched across the glass. Seeing the integration phase of his business model, the empire he had built to be unrecognizable from a legitimate corporation, shattered by a single forensic audit, tore his soul apart. He knelt on the floor, ignoring the dirty water from his coat, and picked up one of the blood-stained bills. That was when he saw the invisible tracking ink glowing under the mall's high-intensity lights, a digital fingerprint left by the Department of Justice. The entire terminal went dead quiet as Vincenzo realized the truth. The clean receipt had become betrayer, and the paper trail was already leading straight to the 5 families. Vincenzo stood in the center of the vault, the air thick with the metallic scent of ink and the copper tang of blood-stained currency. Before him sat the problem of volume, mountainous stacks of $5 and $10 bills that represented the raw, jagged edges of the street. To a street soldier, this was the prize. To Vincenzo, it was a radioactive hazard. You cannot walk into a Chase or a Wells Fargo with $3 million in small bills without triggering every red light audit in the Federal Reserve's arsenal. The banking system is a predator designed to sniff out the scent of unexplained wealth the moment it crosses the threshold. "We don't move the mountain all at once," Vincenzo murmured, his voice as cold and clinical as a surgeon's while he adjusted his fur-collared overcoat. "If we do, the gravity of the cash collapses the bank's ceiling on our heads." He gestured toward the line of men in bespoke suits, his soldier accountants, who waited with the rigid discipline of a corporate phalanx. This was the birth of the placement phase. To solve the volume problem, Vincenzo introduced the art of smurfing. The strategy was a masterclass in decentralized logistics. Instead of one man with a suitcase, Vincenzo deployed a small army of 300 smurfs, associates, cousins, and desperate civilians, each carrying exactly $9,900. By keeping every single deposit below the $10,000 threshold that triggers a mandatory currency transaction report, he effectively turned a tidal wave into millions of tiny droplets. They fanned out across the city, hitting different branches, different tellers, and different zip codes simultaneously. It was a manual DDoS attack on the IRS's tracking system. As he watched the briefcases being filled, Vincenzo felt the rush of a man who had successfully hacked the law. He wasn't just hiding money, he was changing its DNA, beginning the long process of scrubbing the street off the paper until it was clean enough to buy the world. The transition from the street to the showroom required a more elegant touch than the brute force of a bank deposit. Vincenzo stood in the center of the Galleria's high-end corridor, the red glow of the neon signage reflecting off his fur-collared overcoat. To the public, these flagship boutiques, Gucci, Birda, and Louis Reed, were monuments to excess, but to Vincenzo, they were the ultimate high-volume washing machines. He targeted struggling luxury brands, legacy boutiques that had the prestige but lacked the cash flow to survive the digital age. By moving in as a silent partner, he didn't just buy a business, he bought a license to print clean history. The strategy was a masterclass in financial fiction. Each day, as the phalanx of bespoke-suited men marched through the mall, they weren't just carrying briefcases, they were carrying the ghost sales of the empire. Vincenzo directed his team to inflate the daily ledgers with surgical precision. He used the piles of smurfed cash to purchase non-existent alligator skin suits and limited-edition handbags that never actually left the shelf. For every 10 real customers, Vincenzo's team fabricated 20 more, funneling the raw street profits into the store's point-of-sale system. The beauty of the luxury retail front lay in the margins. In a boutique where a single jacket could cost 5 figures, moving $500,000 in a weekend didn't look like a crime. It looked like a successful season. By paying the taxes on these phantom sales, Vincenzo was essentially buying the government's silence with their own cut of the loot. He watched the money literally litter the floor, knowing that by the time it reached the corporate bank account, it would be transformed into legal, taxable income that no auditor could question without a search warrant. He was no longer a mobster hiding in the shadows. He was a titan of industry, hiding in plain sight behind the velvet ropes of the world's most exclusive brands. Once the cash was scrubbed by the luxury storefronts of the Galleria, it entered the most abstract and dangerous phase of the cycle, the layering. Vincenzo watched the digital digits flicker on his encrypted terminal, knowing that each click of a mouse was moving millions of dollars across borders faster than a bullet could travel. The money was no longer physical. It had become a ghost, exiting the retail accounts of New York and reappearing in the palm-fringed bank towers of Panama City and the sun-bleached offices of the Cayman Islands. This was the shadow banking system, a dark mirror of the global financial grid where the 5 families operated as their own central bank, setting their own interest rates and enforcing their own liquidity with a finality no federal regulator could match. The goal was to create a digital labyrinth so complex that the trail of breadcrumbs would catch fire before any forensic accountant could follow it. Vincenzo orchestrated a frantic dance of shell companies, limited liability phantoms with names like Blue Horizon Holdings and Iron Gate Logistics that existed only as brass plates on a door in Georgetown. Money flowed from boutique profits into a Panamanian law firm, was loaned to a shell company in Dublin, and then reinvested into a Caribbean hedge fund, all within a single business day. By the time a DOJ investigator could subpoena the first account, the capital had already been subdivided and reassembled a dozen times over. Vincenzo sat back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his dark, predatory eyes as he adjusted his fur collar of his coat. He understood that layering was the ultimate shell game. It was about distance and distortion. Every offshore hop stripped away another layer of the money's criminal origin until the original blood-stained cash was buried under a mountain of international wire transfers. To the world, Vincenzo was moving capital. To the Commission, he was building a fortress of paper that made the Mafia's wealth as untouchable as the clouds. Repatriating the offshore ghost millions required turning digital digits back into concrete and steel. Vincenzo stood on the skeletal remains of a 30-story luxury high-rise, the wind whistling through the exposed girders as he looked out over the city he was essentially rebuilding with blood-stained capital. This was the construction kickback, the final frontier of the legalization strategy, where the Mafia's wealth was physically cemented into American soil. Vincenzo would use his offshore shell companies to invest in domestic real estate development, buying up prime acreage with the scrubbed profits of the layering phase. The beauty of the construction industry lay in its chaotic accounting and the sheer volume of soft costs that were impossible for an outside auditor to verify. Vincenzo ensured that every crane, every pallet of bricks, and every bag of cement was sourced from mob-controlled vendors. By using unionized labor under his thumb, he could overbill the project for ghost hours and specialized consulting fees that existed only on a spreadsheet. It was a circular economy. The offshore money paid the construction company, which paid the labor, which eventually flowed back into the family's pockets as legitimate, hard-earned salary. The masterstroke, however, was the sale. Once the penthouse doors were hung and the glass facade caught the sun, Vincenzo sold the units to legitimate, high-profile buyers, doctors, lawyers, and tech entrepreneurs. When the closing papers were signed, the Mafia received something far more valuable than cash, a multi-million-dollar check from a reputable title company. This was the ultimate alibi. If the FBI ever asked where the millions came from, Vincenzo wouldn't show them a suitcase. He would show them a deed of sale. He stood at the edge of the rooftop, his fur-collared coat snapping in the wind, knowing that as long as the city kept building, his empire would remain as solid as the foundations beneath his feet. The evolution of the empire required a purge of the old guard, a systematic replacement of muscle with intellect. Vincenzo stood in the center of the high-end corridor, flanked no longer by scars and leather jackets, but by a phalanx of young men in charcoal Armani who moved with the calculated grace of junior partners at a white shoe firm. This was the era of the clean soldier. Vincenzo had realized that in a world of forensic accounting and RICO statutes, a man who could navigate a tax loophole was worth 10 men who could pull a trigger. He had stopped scouring the back alleys of Brooklyn for talent and started headhunting at the Ivy League recruitment fairs, seeking out the hungriest MBAs and the most ruthless JD candidates who were tired of waiting for a partnership that might never come. These new made men didn't swear oaths over burning pictures of saints. They signed non-disclosure agreements and ironclad employment contracts. They didn't carry unregistered magnums. They carried encrypted laptops and legal briefs that could bury an opponent under a mountain of litigation before the first shot was even fired. Vincenzo watched them march through the luxury mall, their briefcases filled with the paperwork of 1,000 shell companies, their eyes as cold and predatory as any hitman's, but hidden behind the soft glow of smartphone screens. To the world, they were the rising stars of the financial sector. To the Commission, they were the new front line of an invisible war. The genius of the clean soldier lay in their deniability. When a rival business refused to be absorbed, Vincenzo didn't send a car to spray the storefront. He sent a team of forensic accountants to find a discrepancy in their payroll and a fleet of lawyers to file an injunction that froze their assets. It was a bloodless execution, performed in the light of day with the full backing of the court system. Vincenzo adjusted the fur collar of his coat, feeling the immense power of this intellectual army. He understood that the greatest trick the Mafia ever pulled was convincing the world that they were still just thugs in tracksuits, while in reality, the new dons were sitting in corner offices, killing empires with a keystroke and a smile. The street was becoming too loud, and the physical weight of paper was starting to drag the empire toward the earth. Vincenzo stood in his private suite above the Galleria, the red neon of the luxury mall casting a surgical glow across the banks of high-speed monitors that had replaced the traditional ledgers of the Commission. This was the digital pivot, a transition into a world where money moved at the speed of light, leaving the cumbersome logistics of suitcases and smurfing behind. As the federal government began tightening its grip on physical currency with new know-your-customer protocols, Vincenzo realized that the only way to stay invisible was to become data. He began experimenting with a new architecture of deception, utilizing early digital wire transfers to bounce funds through a global network of shell companies before the ink on a transaction could even dry. The business model was no longer built on the sidewalk. It was built on the backbone of emerging fiber optic cables. Vincenzo watched the transfers move from his luxury retail fronts in New York to a holding company in Cyprus, then to a consultancy in Singapore, each hop stripping away another layer of origin. It was a ghost in the machine, a phantom flow of capital that didn't need a driver, a guard, or a trunk to move across the Atlantic. However, the digital frontier brought a new, more chaotic breed of war. The pivot was put to a brutal test when a rival family, sensing the shift in the wind, attempted to hijack a clean transfer of $40 million mid-transit. They didn't use a hit squad, they used a corrupt bank insider and a sophisticated phishing exploit to divert the funds into an untraceable account in the Seychelles. Vincenzo watched the transaction flag red on his screen, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted the fur collar of his overcoat. It was a heist performed in silence, a theft of bits that carried the weight of a decade of street work. But Vincenzo's clean soldiers were prepared. While the rivals played with codes, Vincenzo's team of Ivy League-educated hackers and financial architects counterattacked by flooding the rivals' server with a localized DDoS while simultaneously triggering an anonymous suspicious activity report to the very bank the rivals were using. The transfer froze, the funds returned to the safety of the Moretti ledger, and the rival family was left exposed to a federal audit they weren't prepared to handle. Vincenzo sat back, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off his cold, composed face. He understood that in the digital age, the Reaper didn't just come for your life, he came for your access. Vincenzo stood on the private terrace of a glass-walled penthouse, the city lights below shimmering like the circuits of a great machine he finally controlled. This was the integration phase, the crowning achievement where the line between criminal enterprise and corporate hegemony dissolved completely. The raw, blood-stained cash of the past had been fully digested by the system, re-emerging as the lifeblood of legitimate chains that spanned the coast. The Mafia no longer just worked the streets, they owned the streets, the sidewalks, and the buildings rising from them. From national waste management conglomerates that held municipal contracts to the very luxury malls where Vincenzo once stood as a ghost, the empire was now an indomitable fact of the American economy. He adjusted the heavy fur collar of his overcoat, a gold watch glinting under the terrace lights, as he prepared to enter the ballroom behind him. He was no longer a man to be feared in shadows. He was a titan of industry, a benefactor whose name was whispered in reverence in the halls of power. His calendar was a relentless parade of ribbon cuttings and high-stakes political fundraisers, where governors and senators shook his hand, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that the champagne they sipped was paid for by the clean dividends of 1,000 street-level sins. Vincenzo had mastered the ultimate alchemy. He had turned fear into respectability and extortion into equity.
The business model had reached its zenith. By owning the waste management firms, they controlled the city's logistics. By owning the restaurants and malls, they controlled the city's culture. It was a perfect, self-sustaining loop where the Mafia's legitimate profits were used to lobby for laws that protected their illegitimate origins. Vincenzo looked at his reflection in the tinted glass, seeing a man who had successfully engineered a world where the law was just another commodity to be bought and sold. He was the architect of a new reality, one where the family was just another word for a board of directors, and the only thing that mattered was the quarterly growth of their invisible, invincible empire. The silence of the Galleria Mall had always been Vincenzo's sanctuary, but tonight the hum of the cooling fans in the server rooms sounded like a countdown. For years, he believed that the complexity of the shadow banking system made him untouchable. He had built a labyrinth of offshore shell companies and high-end retail fronts designed to be a permanent shield for the five families. But the fatal flaw of any business model built on human nature is that it only takes one person to stop looking at the legend and start looking at the math. That person was a junior forensic accountant with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, an obsessive who didn't care about the fur-collared coats or the gold watches. He only cared about a discrepancy of 4 cents in a Gucci boutique's ledger. The error was a ghost in the machine, a rounding mistake in a Smurf deposit that didn't align with the boutique's reported inventory. It was the thread that, when pulled, began to unravel the entire tapestry of the integration phase. The investigator didn't find a murder weapon. He found a ghost company that existed only as a brass plate in the Cayman Islands, which had supposedly provided marketing consulting to a New York construction firm. Slowly, the Department of Justice began to map the flow, using the very digital transfers Vincenzo once thought were his greatest innovation to chart the movement of capital back to the street. The FBI didn't move with sirens, they moved with subpoenas. Using the power of the RICO Act, federal prosecutors began to connect the clean stores of the Galleria to the dirty crimes of the back alleys. They argued that the boutiques, the waste management contracts, and the high-rise skeletons were not separate businesses, but the vital organs of a single, continuing criminal enterprise. Vincenzo watched from his monitors as his clean soldiers were intercepted not by hitmen, but by agents carrying boxes of seized hard drives. The paper trail he had worked so hard to forge was no longer his alibi. It was the roadmap to a life sentence. Vincenzo adjusted the collar of his coat, feeling the sudden biting chill of the air conditioning. He realized too late that by integrating into the legitimate world, he had subjected the Mafia to the one thing it could never survive: an audit. The clean receipt, the weapon he had chosen over the Tommy gun, was now being used to write the final chapter of the 5 families. The end did not come with a bang or a spray of glass. It came with the rhythmic, clinical thud of a federal stamp hitting a mountain of asset forfeiture forms. Vincenzo stood in the center of the Galleria Mall, the high-intensity lights reflecting off his fur-collared overcoat for the last time as the phalanx of agents systematically shuttered his life's work. One by one, the glowing neon signs of the boutiques, the washing machines he had so carefully acquired, flickered and died, leaving the corridor in a cold, dim twilight. The soldier accountants who once marched with military precision were now being led away in handcuffs, their Armani suits wrinkled, their encrypted laptops transformed into the state's primary evidence. As he watched the yellow tape wrap around the pillars of his empire, Vincenzo was struck by the crushing irony of his own genius. He had spent a decade obsessed with the problem of volume, convincing the commission that the only way to survive was to stop being gangsters and start being shareholders. He had moved the money through the digital labyrinth of Panama and the Caymans, built the city's skyline with construction kickbacks, and integrated the Mafia into the very fabric of the legitimate world. He had successfully made the money legal, but in doing so, he had committed the ultimate sin of the underworld. He had made it traceable. In the old days, a suitcase of cash buried in a backyard could be forgotten, but a clean receipt is a permanent record that never stops speaking to the IRS. By building a corporate hierarchy that mirrored the Fortune 500, he had provided the FBI with a perfect organizational chart to decapitate the 5 families in a single afternoon. The transparency required to be a titan of industry was exactly what the forensic accountants needed to identify every shadow and every ghost company he had ever created. The mall was now a silent, hollow shell, a prison of paper where the walls were made of subpoenas and the bars were made of ledgers. Vincenzo looked at a single $100 bill fluttering across the floor, identical to the ones that had littered the ground when he first presented his legalization strategy. Back then, it was a symbol of infinite potential. Now, it was just a discarded relic of a failed business model. He realized too late that the Mafia was never meant to survive the light of legitimacy. As the heavy oak doors of the exit were chained shut, the ghost finally understood his legacy. He hadn't saved the Mafia from the law. He had simply invited the law into the family to conduct the final audit. The Mafia stopped being a gang and became a corporation. But every corporation has an audit. And for the Mafia, the audit ends in a life sentence.